hats off to Maria, what she does, what she has done, especially during this pandemic, letting this festival occur last summer especially. I am just amazed. I can't salute her enough. It is a pleasure to be here. Welcome to the Literary Roundtable, which happens every summer at Festival. This summer we're going to feature translation front and center. Let me just say briefly right now, immediately to my right is Randi Ward, who's just brilliant in so many ways, and I'll say some of those ways in a moment, and Jeremy Paden, equally brilliant, although perhaps in some different ways, and we'll find out about that in a minute. I did promise that I would make a few remarks about translation myself, and so that's where we'll start. I've been excited about this even before Ken Burns's special on Hemingway, but as I reread A Movable Feast this past winter, I came across this amazing little discussion, which you may or may not remember. The she at the end of this little conversation is Constant Garnett, I believe, a translator of from the Russian. Anyway, it goes like this. The first voice is Hemingway. I've been wondering about Dostoevsky, I said. How can a man write so badly, so unbelievably badly, and make you feel so deeply? It can't be the translation, Evans said. She makes Tolstoy come out well written. So you two, I'm expecting, will have brilliant comments to make about that. So anyway, that's one of the ways the seed for this summer's roundtable featuring translation began with me. Unless anyone thinks today's subject is somehow too arcane, suitable only for academics or those who don't know any other language, George Steiner says this at once upon a time: without translation, we would be living in provinces bordering on silence. If you think about that, I think that's really a powerful observation. Or to underscore what I'd say now, at this point in American cultural life, we have an urgent need for translation. Quote, translators are the shadow heroes of literature, the often forgotten instruments that make it possible for different cultures to talk to one another, who have enabled us to understand that we all, from every part of the world, live in one world. And that's the inimitable Paul Auster. Myself, I can't wait to hear Randi and Jeremy. Personally, I think I first became aware of translation, though I wouldn't have understood it this way then, hearing my mother talk about her love for her favorite high school English teacher who taught her Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the original Middle English. This is in a small farming town in rural Indiana in the 40s. It's a remarkable observation to me to think on that. My own facility with languages have remained beyond my reach. I failed 4 hours of Germany at Bethany College because I was high. So how do you translate just say no? I don't know. My first real translation, this is a guess, but I'm thinking was probably through the Beat poets, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights books, and this little volume here of Yevgeny Yevtushenko called Flowers and Bullets. What I'd like to know, and here's unfortunately neither of you know Russian, I don't think, but by the time Ferlinghetti did this book of Yevtushenko was clearly bilingual. And so there's no translator's name on here. And I don't think just because they left him off. I think Yevtushenko did all this. What I'd love to see is somebody go back to an old issue of Pravda and translate the original Yevtushenko from the Russian themselves and see how it matched up to Yevtushenko's English. Who knows? It is good to be reminded of what comes with the translation. One of the lines in here in the poem about the Kent State massacres during the Vietnam War, bullets don't like people who love flowers. They're jealous, ladies. Bullets short on kindness. Alison Krauss, 19 years old. You're dead for loving flowers. So If you ever see it, you might want to pick up this old City Lights book. I wonder if my first real translation, in spirit again, mind you, was not, in fact, through the wonderful guidance of Ken Sullivan, who many of you know ran the West Virginia Humanities Council for years. Ken steered me to the original Jack Tales when I was doing lots of storytelling, not Richard Chase's famous little red books that had the Jack Tales in them. Wonderful as those are, it was the 40s when everything had to be squeaky clean. I found the original field recordings, thanks to Ken, by James Taylor Adams and Gaines Kilgore, and they're much darker, much sexier, and loads of fun. And I love to tell those Jack Tales to adult audiences. And there was a kind of translation that had to go on there for me to tell those stories. I was doing a close reading of the text and trying to juggle my intention, trying to juggle that with voice, with audience, with accuracy, with things I'm guessing were the right kind of jugglings, which I hope you two will help me discern whether that was, whether I was headed in the right direction. My only other foray into translation, again, not literally, was retelling old versions of Scandinavian folk and fairy tales. And I found these stories, but they hadn't been retold in anything but the newest versions were Victorian English. And I realized they were completely inappropriate for today's children. So I took to translating Victorian English into modern English. But what connection there was to the original Scandinavian languages, of course, I have no idea. But again, when I did that, and I even published one of them, some old Icelandic hide story, I was still trying to get, what accuracy I could discern from that Victorian English for what would be possible in a modern telling. And lastly, and now on to my friends here, the last 20 years, maybe this is the other reason translation has been so much in my mind, I realized that 3 of the poets that have dominated my psyche as I've written the past few years have been Wisława Szymborska, the Polish Nobel Prize-winning poet, and Jean Follain, the French poet, and the Swedish poet Tomas Tranströmer. And each of those poets have gotten under my skin in a way that wouldn't let me go and impressed upon me how absolutely important translation is. Let me end with this quotation from the Poetry Translation Center, Octavia Lamb in London. At a time of conflict, translating poetry offers a way through to respect an understanding of differences and variety, and a way to alight on those things which make us all feel human, feeling love, fear, joy. The gift of poetry translated, the lyrical alchemy of transforming from one language into another, words that speak of heritage, challenge, identity, so they can then be shared across borders and throughout communities. This is the beating heart of poetry translation. Well, and now to make that ever more real, Jeremy and Randi. Let's begin with Jeremy. Jeremy is the author of the chapbook Broken Tulips and many other books, which you see here. His poems have been appeared in magazines across the nation, Adirondack Review, Atlanta Review, Beloit, the California Quarterly. He's a 2013 finalist for the Nazim Hikmet Poetry Competition. His translations of poems from the Spanish have appeared in Words Without Borders. His articles on Latin American and Spanish literature have appeared in Calliope, Journal for Renaissance and Baroque Hispanic Poetry, Colonial Latin American Review, Review of International American Studies, Romance Quarterly, and many others. He holds a PhD in Spanish and Latin American literature from no less than Emory University. Impressive credentials, but even more so, there's a children's book and obviously several others about which maybe you'll speak. Jeremy, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's the obvious letdown after such a generous introduction now. Now I get to stand here. But to go back to the importance of translation and the role that translation has played in literature, I'd like to just briefly mention 3 key moments in the history of Western literature. The first of these being the sonnet that we all know and love, the Shakespearean sonnet that comes to us. The sonnet comes from a small little island off the coast of Italy, first sort of toyed with in the courts of the Emperor Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. It's here where the sonnet is developed. This is the form that then Dante takes over and Petrarch continues, and that then sweeps all of Europe, so that you have, by the time we get to the 16th and 17th centuries, sonnets being written in German, sonnets being written in French, sonnets being written in English, and given that it's the 16th century, sonnets being written also in the Americas. That form is developed, again, in this small, it is the metropolitan center because it's the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, but in this small little island. And it's through the art of translation that the sonnet then is spread. We can debate whether or not the prose poem is poetry or if it's prose, but there's this relationship between Whitman being translated into the French, being picked up by Baudelaire, being picked up by Rimbaud, and them playing with Whitman's free verse that then in French, in Baudelaire's Spleen, becomes these small little prose essays. That moves, at least in the history of Spanish-American literature, that moves into Latin America in Chile, through a guy named Pedro Prado, in Nicaragua, and then throughout all of Spain in the works of somebody by the name of Rubén Darío. In his first collection, Azul, we have both versed and rhymed lyric poems and these beautifully wrought small little prose pieces that now, whether we're talking about dictionary definition poems, or we're talking about the small sort of lyric essays that someone like Ross Gay has been doing in his Book of Delights. Over the course of the 20th century, this thing known as the prose poem has really sort of taken off. And it is, again, through this art of translation, and as things move from one language to another, and you're looking for new ways of expression and something that is going to invigorate the language, we come across new ways. And earlier we talked about City Lights and that lovely volume that is happening right in the 40s and the 50s. And if we look at what happens in American poetry in the 40s and in the 50s, and then especially in the 60s, specifically looking at the work of people like Robert Bly, looking at the work of people like James Wright, looking at the work of people like W.S. Merwin, looking also at Denis Levertov. These are all poets who begin writing in the 40s, maybe even a little bit earlier, late 30s and in the 40s, and they're writing in highly formal poetry. Right? They have studied under people like John Crow Ransom. They've studied under people like Theodore Rothke. They're writing heavily, or not heavily, but they're writing very sort of tightly controlled formal poems that also play with irony and play with ambiguity in the ways that the new critical school or the new criticism is really interested in. W.S. Merwin, his Yale Younger Award-winning collection of poems, plays with a whole bunch of forms from the Provençal. He's spent, right, he graduates, he goes to France, And he goes to France to sort of cut his teeth as a poet, spends his time studying the Provençal poetry that is sort of the birth of modern European verse. It is the Provençal poetry that gives birth 100 years later in the court of Frederick II to the sonnet. And his first handful of collections of poems are tightly controlled formal poems that play with Provençal language, that play with Provençal form, and that express themselves in very sort of medieval tropes. In the 50s, he begins translating people like Pablo Neruda. He begins translating people like César Vallejo. He begins translating people who are part of the Latin American and the European avant-garde, and part of what the Latin American and the European avant-garde have done is they have left behind radically formal poetry. By what is it, 68 or so, when The Lice comes out, Merwin has left behind anything that looks like rhyme. He's left behind anything that looks like your traditional metered verse. And he's writing in free verse. Now, this is part of a conversation that he's been having with James Wright, that he's been having with Robert Bly. It's tied up with the deep image, but it is also Bly and Wright's work with people like Thomas Tranströmer and other poets that are generating this new mode of writing. Denise Levertov is slightly different in that she really does have a tight connection with William Carlos Williams and the kinds of experimentations that William Carlos Williams is doing. That's probably enough about that. But with this question of translation, I'd like to read a poem by, possibly two poems, by a Chilean poet. Her name is Alexandra Dominguez. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about her poetry, right? So she is from Chile. She lives in Chile until she's about 17 or 18, at which point, 2 or 3 years after the coup, she moves to Spain. And in Spain, she goes to study art. So she is formed as a visual artist. But she's also a poet. And here is a lovely little poem of hers called Insulas. And I'll read the first line in Spanish and then I'll read it in English. No te quedes al borde de las cosas, le dijo la señorita Emily a la señorita Bishop. Isles. Don't keep to the edges of things, said Miss Emily to Miss Bishop. But don't go reckless either into the abyss of words, said Miss Bishop to Miss Emily. The two chased each other about like the yes and no of a daisy. Both had a collection of butterflies with their insinuations. Don't color yourself in heavenly blue, said the Gothic Miss to the island map Miss. That's how they addressed each other, like intimates in the dark, humble country girls at the sun's fun fair. Well, one, it's a lovely poem. But I think also, especially for a US audience, one of the things that's interesting is to hear a poet playing with Elizabeth Bishop and Emily Dickinson and a relationship that they might have had. And she herself reads them in English, but she's writing in Spanish. But we have this transnational, intralingual relationship going on in this poem and in her own preparation as a poet. And I'll read one more poem by Alexandra Dominguez called The Bandit's Ballad, or just Bandit's Ballad. It's not easy to meet up with a man like Buffalo Bill, who isn't Buffalo Bill, who's the strongest man in all of Michigan, but doesn't live in Michigan, who's the fastest quick-draw cowboy, but keeps no bullets in his gun, who comes galloping down from the prairies, but has no horse, who enters a cantina, but is not thirsty, who takes pity if someone draws with no other recourse than to be felled by a bullet. Truly, it's not easy to know a man like Buffalo Bill, who isn't Buffalo Bill, who's respected by Sioux chiefs in the way that the white eagle is still respected in the mountains, who's the most beautiful lover in all of Michigan, from Minnesota to New Mexico, from his silver belt buckle to the Rocky Mountains of Utah preachers. I'm trying to say it's not easy to fall in love with a man who chases down horse thieves. It's not easy to go to bed with him and sleep in his arms and dream of bison. A man who has a savage look in his eyes, but who's not a savage. A man in the vicinity of Buffalo Bill, who's not an old jackal forgotten beneath a sheriff's badge, who robs warehouses and buys flowers on Saturdays with stolen money. A man who calls loss, loss, and failure he calls failure. I want to say, that's what I want to say. It's not easy. You know, one of the wonderful things about this poem is the humor that's playing throughout the whole thing. But also, again, there's this distance that happens, it seems to me, as a citizen of these United States reading a poem like this, where you've got Michigan and Buffalo Bill and New Mexico and Minnesota. And it's like looking at the American West, and specifically the American West as portrayed in the films of the 50s and 60s. It's like looking at the American West through a funhouse mirror, and through this funhouse mirror that is part of, at least parts of Latin America and then Southern Europe's imagination of what the U.S. is. There's all these lovely imprecisions in terms of geography, and but it adds to the expansiveness and then also to the humor of the poem. By and large, in terms of translating a poet like Alejandra Dominguez, it does go to voice, and it goes to sort of wanting to make sure that one is able to keep the humor and keep the tenderness in the relationship that she, say, with the Emily and the Elizabeth poem. There's an ease to it in some ways because she's writing in free verse. She's not working within the constraints of formal poetry, which create a whole other headache. But I will put her aside for the moment, and from her I will move to Ali Calderon. Ali Calderon is a Mexican poet. He is a professor at the Benemérita in Puebla, Mexico, and I'll read just a selection of this last poem in this book called Las Correspondencias. It's from a section called Piedra de Sacrificio, or Sacrificial Stone, and it is one long poem called Mexican Democracy. What is interesting about the poem, especially to a reader of Spanish, is you have an introductory section that is the language is taken straight out of your dailies, straight out of it. It could be the sort of newspaper headlines that you read walking down the street or that you hear over the television, and then it switches into a language that plays with the Spanish from the 16th century. And it does this both with diction, but it especially does this, and one notices, especially in Spanish when looking at it, it does this with spelling. Spanish, as with English, Spanish spelling over the last 400 years has changed. It's not changed as much as with English, but there are some changes. So I'll read just the first bits of this. Mexican democracy. Another corpse found in a black bag. Near there, a body, the wind, a bridge. 2 blocks away, a head full of hair, eyes open. In other news, 30 executed over the weekend, bullet to the head, some with signs of torture, the failed rescue of a kidnapping, a finger, a ring, a wad of newspaper. In other news, the campaigns have ended, have begun. There is goodwill in Washington, immigration reform. Over the last 2 months, there has been a 1-point drop in poverty rates, in well-being, in luck. In the distance, a truck rumbles, and then silence. They open the black bag, the stench, the mold on the body, a newborn girl. And we climbed the 114 long steps to that house of worship, its black stones so scabrous our hands burned. I saw there the neighboring towns, the Ocote Wood and Tiger Market, Tlatelolco. From the small courtyard on the top, we beheld below the sweet water that runneth down from Chapultepec. Iztapalapa, Tlacopan, Tepeaquilla, all was lorded by our eyes. We turned our backs and saw a constellation, the shapes and bodies of their idols, evil images, all of a much greater stature than a large man, and formed roughly of clay and dough and legumes, hand formed of seeds and blood taken from hearts, human offal as if flour. So what I did in that second section, once we moved to and we climbed the 114 long steps to that house of worship, was go back to William Bradford, go back to Roger Williams. So William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. Roger Williams is, a book on the a key into the language of of America, right? He has Roger Williams, the celebrated sort of founder of Rhode Island, wrote a little primer on the Narragansett language in about the 1640s, right? So while there's 100 years difference, say, between the 1640s and the language of someone like William Bradford and Roger Williams, and the situation of Cortez coming into the valley of central Mexico, right? This happened in 1520 or so. 1519 is when they land in Veracruz. By 1521, Tenochtitlan has fallen, and he's playing with the language of Cortez's letters back to the king and the accounts that then are written in the early 16th century, right? Most of the Anglo-colonial documents that we have that are comparable come from 100 years later, right? And it is William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. So I went back to their language and to the original documents, to the way they spelled, to their use of capitalization, to their use of the extra P's and the E's that we love on our oldie shoppies, and peppered that throughout that translation. And this poem itself has been translated by a couple of other people that don't do that. And so as an English reader reading those other versions, you don't experience the same sort of shock of where are we when reading. And it felt to me particularly that to really sort of, the challenge of this poem is finding a cultural equivalent in the translation. I don't want to take up too much more time. I will talk briefly about this. This is now some of my own work. This is a children's book that was published last year, and it was illustrated by a student of mine. She's from Panama, and it is about the migrant caravans. And so I wrote it, and I wrote it as I was writing it, knowing that I also wanted to translate it into Spanish. It didn't make it this way into the book itself, but knowing that I wanted to write it or have it translated into Spanish. One of the things that I tried to do in terms of looking for a form was looking for a form that both languages share and that functions in a similar way. And both languages, now there's slight differences, both languages have a ballad form. And the ballad form is a storytelling form, and the ballad form is, it's that form that you get setting aside trucks and dogs and cheap beer that you get in country songs. You especially get this, say, in Dolly Parton's her murder ballads, right? And these are murder ballads that she's working with and rewriting, and that she's pulling straight from this longer Appalachian tradition that goes back to Scotland. And these are written in ballad form. 4 stanzas, ABBA. In English, I'm going to mess this up. I want to say that in English it's a 4-beat meter that we get. It's a tetrameter, if I remember correctly. Spanish has a ballad form. You don't rhyme all of your lines. You just rhyme in the pairs. So it's just a rhyme on the second and the fourth. And it is in an octasílabo, which is an 8-syllable count line. The problem is English and Spanish don't line up in terms of their syllable counts. And most things, when you go from English to Spanish, end up being, and I forget if it's longer or shorter, but you end up with more syllables in one versus the other. I want to say that you end up with fewer syllables in Spanish, but I could be wrong at the moment. I should have checked that. But so I wrote it originally in a ballad form. I translated it. One version that was faithful and one version that said, hell, I'm the poet, I can do what I want, and I'll make this super poetry. And I sent it to a friend of mine, and he wrote back and said, dude, that English was great. That Spanish, what are you doing? You ruined it. And so he sent me his own translation. And so I took his translation and my first version, and I sort of melded them together. And it's this. It's the situation as a mother telling her daughter why they've left Honduras and why they're sitting now at the border. We are people of the corn, mija. We grind it on metates, soak it in cal, and grind it down to masa for tortillas. In the morning, we drink its milk warmed with cacao, vanilla, and canela. People of the corn make their home in the forest. Abuela would say, where Quetzal and Cotinga sing near rivers and streams that leap free. At night, the jaguar guards their sleep. When I tell Quetzal and jaguar stories, I tell you things Abuela told me as a child. For you and I, mija, were born in Tegucigalpa. Raised among the concrete and zinc of Tegus, we'd never seen a Quetzal, or heard monkeys howl and hoot, or felt the swoop of a bat's wings until we fled the city north toward Guatemala and beyond. Abuela came from the mountains. She knew each tree by name. She told me the stories I tell you so I would know who I was and not fall in with the glue huffers who lose themselves in fumes after a day of selling oranges, rags, and street corner nothings. Abuela told of when families lived in mountain villages and maíz was grown in milpas with frijoles and tomates. This was before failed crops, late frosts, before floods and drugs drowned tegus. Mija, it's not that once there was peace and now there's none. You, me, Abuela were born in an age of war, born under the ocelot sun. Before the cartels, there were the contras, before the contras, the football war and the banana wars and the wars of liberation. But there's beauty too in Tegus. When you were a chichi, artists took over an abandoned state prison, crumbling under the weight of all the violence those walls had witnessed. Jugglers, drummers, and butterflies on stilts partied in the prison quad. You left a handprint in purple and a handprint in yellow. They turned the prints of the children into a field of flowers. But we need to eat, and hope buys no food. Your tío Misael, who rode La Bestia north for work until they sent him back, broken, came with us to the prison party. He was sober, still living. Cousin Carmen and Mar, her daughter, also came and celebrated with us. They helped paint flowers on the wall. This was before the gangs stole Mar, before the needle stole Carmen. So many girls, mija, lost, swallowed by the hungry belly of the earth. And hunger, a different hunger has led us here, a hunger for peace, for justice. Mija, those birds we'd never seen, the quetzal and the scarlet macaw, are a treasure protected by laws. And you are more precious than they. That's why we've pushed, pulled, carried you north through jungle heat, hidden you from guards on the hunt. That's why we've come, indios, mestizos, garifuna, catrachos, guanacos, chapines. Together we've crossed rivers, mountains, cities, and borders. We've brought you to this waiting place, this arid land of rattlers and coyotes, to this wall. Precious things are worth 1,000-mile walk, mija. They are worth hunger and risk, and treasures, mija, are worth dying for, if that means those treasures are given the chance to live. Mija, we are a people who find a way, a people who survive. Mija, we are people of the corn. And I'll show, let's see, some of the illustrations. She did an absolutely stunning job. And I will have one more poem, and then I will turn everything over to Randi. This is from a collection of poems. It's on colonial Latin America. It came out just this March. And while these are in English, though I use some Spanish and I use some Quechua and I use some Nahuatl in them, translation did play a role in it. Among the things that I did when writing and rewriting and as part of the process of revision for these was, or at least for specific ones of these, I would translate them into Spanish and then back into English, specifically looking in the prose poems, looking for the use of hyperbaton, which is syntactical rearrangement, which is very common both in Spanish poetry, but also in a lot of Spanish language. Its closeness to Latin and the way that Latin plays with syntax and has a much freer syntax because of being a cased language, though Spanish is not. Spanish has retained a lot of that syntactical rearrangement and play that in poetry and in the 16th century was used quite a bit. This one is called The Captain Does Not Understand Their Speech. and it's about Ramon Pane. Ramon Pane was a Hieronymite monk left by Columbus on the north shore of Hispaniola to gather information about the Taino people there. And he's written one of the strangest little books of cultural and religious anthropology because he didn't speak the Arawakan language. And it is as if he were tripping on mushrooms. Maybe not the things that prevented German from becoming a success over here. And with this, I'll be quiet. The captain does not understand their speech. Paradoxes, Pane knows. How all people are one, though the fathers are three. How sin is written in the blood and in the flesh. He confuses not symbol for what lies beyond the sign, knows hierarchies of thought, argument, knows the work of verbs on objects, how agents act, first God, then man, then woman who ate the fruit, then world brought forth brambles, knows man to be homo laborans, life to be a search. And yet here on this north shore, the captain writes, there is no order to this tongue, and what should go before comes after. One word can mean 1,000 things, and the dead and the gods, who can tell one from the other? What is this land where the solstice does not order seasons, where women till the earth and tend conucos, land where bread and drink are made from poisoned roots, not golden seeds buried and born again, where fruit ripens year-round on trees without work, and reptiles are husbanded for food? And what is this cacique dance, this areito? Why are all their songs like wind on water, like a lover calling his beloved as she leaves at dawn, like the talk between the living and the dead, between gods and devotees, like waves on sand? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. That was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I learned so much. I was taking notes. Wow, wasn't that terrific? God, what a good reader you are, too. Randi Ward. It's a pleasure to introduce Randi. She is a poet, a translator, a lyricist, and a photographer from Belleville, West Virginia. That's just south of Parkersburg. She completed her undergraduate degree at Ohio University and subsequently earned her MA in Cultural Studies from the University of the Faroe Islands. In 2013, she won the American Scandinavian Foundation's Nadia Christensen Prize for her translation, I Won't Even Try, Poulsson's Failure, published in 2013. This marked the first time in the International Translation Competition's history that a work of literature translated from the Faeroese was awarded the prize. It's a really very big deal because it's a really unique and interesting place are the Faroe Islands, and Randi's translation brought this poet into real limelight as he deserved. Whip Stitches, right there, is Randi's second collection of poetry. Her photography and writing have also appeared in Asymptote, Beloit Poetry Journal, Cimarron Review, Wenzel Anthology of Contemporary Faroese Literature, World Literature Today, and many others. Cornell University Library established the Randi Ward Collection in the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections in 2015. She's got a website, randiward.com. Let me also add that I'm always knocked out that she's done translations for some of these wonderful pop and rock bands from Iceland and the Faroe Islands that people that I really enjoy listening to and have discovered that Randi's the translator for those lyrics. Anyway, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Randi here this afternoon. All yours.
I've got the mic. Okay, since this is recorded for posterity's sake, I think for once I'll be honest. No, Mark asked us to think a little bit about translation in our lives. You know, growing up on a farm as I did, my grandfather was stationed with the Allied staff in Berlin when the Berlin Wall went up. So my mother was in Berlin when she was very, very young. And so through our house sometimes when I was a kid with my grandparents, these people would show up from Europe speaking these languages. And so, you know, I would hear foreign languages sometimes, but of course I didn't understand. I think also everyone in my family being their own special kind of people, each one of them was like a language in itself. You're going between all these people, all these worlds, and the different households. So I think sometimes we forget the role. We translate ourselves, we translate each other all the time, constantly, our emotions. I went to school at a 3-room school near the farm where I grew up, and there was a lot of music in the school, but they didn't have the actual sheet music for everybody. And I was one of the people that could just hear it and memorize it so someone else could have the music. And I think having that ear for rhythms has helped me learn languages later in life. I can just hear it and repeat it and mimic it, and I think that's helped me a lot. So I also remember learning, they taught us some songs in Yiddish, and I remember a song in Spanish, and we didn't really know what the words meant, but we were still saying the words, and that sort of piqued my curiosity. When I was 16, I left to go to Norway as an exchange student with AFS. I just wanted to get away from here as soon as possible. And I would have gone anywhere, but it was just sort of coincidence that I ended up going to Norway, and also coincidence that my first name is a fairly common woman's name in Norway, Randi. But I ended up going to Skeisvang videregående. It was a high school on the west coast of Norway, in Haugesund. And getting to Norway, it was a whole different experience for me because they have writers on their money. Sigurd Undset, Knut Hamsun, Henrik Ibsen. You know, writers have a whole different place in their culture, and their language is revered, and the poets are sort of the rock stars of the country, and they're keeping their culture alive. They're making the language that people use every day, and so they're very much respected. And one quick note, growing up as I did, I never really saw any writers or poets where I was, and at the time when I was a kid, there just weren't a lot of programs for that. The little school I went to didn't even have a library. So I remember, I think the first like living, breathing writer I ever saw was probably Maggie Anderson in Morgantown when I was maybe 14. And I remember being just sort of walking around looking at her, and like following her and looking at her. And I actually had a little workshop with her, but you know, just when I got to Norway, there was a poet in the town. His name is Kolbein Folkeid, and he had been a teacher at the school where I went to high school, but he was retired at that time. But he was he's a quite famous contemporary Norwegian poet, and especially at that time because there was a band in Norway. They were actually the composer for the band, and he had been neighbors. So they used a lot of his lyrics in their songs, and the songs were very popular in Norway at the time. So, you know, everyone was singing his lyrics and memorized them, and they were very beautiful. So there you were, seeing this poet walking around town, and he's writing about the life there, and I remember being very fascinated by him. He's in his 80s now, but it's a bit ironic too, because he was working with this composer, and I admired him so much for that and realized that that's one way you can really get your poetry out in the world. But then later, that same band worked with a Faeroese woman, and they did an album. And then 20 years later, I ended up doing an album with her. So it's just interesting how, you know, over a period of 20 years, being this like scared, broken kid from West Virginia is like walking around looking at the poets, you know, to being able to collaborate with those people. Just that journey was really difficult, but also amazing for me, and Norway had a big part in that, and this poet in particular. That's why I'm going to start with him. He was also a translator, which is another important part of his story, but because I admired him so much, I wanted to just share a few poems of his. Now, I'm thinking here. These are not finished translations, but I brought them because they were some of the first ones I did when I was young, just to show you how I've changed. Because I think one of the questions Marc asked us to think about was, when do you know a translation is done? They're never done. I feel like they're never done. You know, every time I look at it with all my experience, I would translate it differently or see different aspects of it. So I just wanted to share a few of these poems with you because he was such an important poet in my life. I'm going to read the Norwegian and the English. Søvnen. Søvnen et barns fottrinn gjennom verden. I mørket rundt oss dikter solen sitt lys. Før vi våkner, vandrer vi på innsiden av livet. Når vi får forstand, henger vi drømmene fra oss i garderoben. Etter forestillingen finner vi dem ikke igjen, og går kulsende ut i høstrekker av hverdager. Sleep. Sleep is a child's footsteps through the world. In the darkness surrounding us, the sun writes its light. We wander along the interior of life until we awaken. When we come to our senses, we hang our dreams in the coat room. We can't find them again after the performance and go shivering out into the gusty autumn of everyday life. A couple things that I looked at here, just going back. In the title, it's actually The Sleep. And originally I just put sleep, but then I thought that's important, the sleep. You know, what kind of particular sleep is it? With the word garderoben, you know, you could do cloakroom, coat room, wardrobe, and because it looked like, you talk about performance, like you're in a theater, like you're in everyday life. I chose the coat room. I might do that differently, but I'm not sure. Another issue that I had was, that I marked was the line, på innsiden av livet, which is like your innermost life, but on the inside of life, like you're inside your own consciousness in your head. But, you know, I put, we wander along the interior of life. I'm not really sure I like that. But, you know, that's what I did at the time. But, you know, going back, you always question yourself. Another interesting thing about learning Norwegian as my first foreign language, since I went to the west coast of Norway, there are two different Norwegian languages, bokmål and nynorsk, and about 10% of the country, they speak nynorsk. So where I lived, and that's on the west coast, so that nynorsk, the west coast language, aligns you more with Icelandic and Faeroese, whereas the east coast language aligns you more with Swedish and Danish. So it was interesting because when I was in school, I'd open my textbooks and one page would be the bokmål, the same text, you'd have it in two different languages. And they were different enough that you needed, you know, so I was like, oh man.
And that's two different Norwegian languages.
Right.
Oh, jeez.
All right, so, but that was really unique that I ended up on the west coast of Norway and that I learned, the dialect that I learned, I mean, even though these are just written languages, bokmål and nynorsk, and everyone speaks a sort of a mix of all of them, depending on where you are in the country. But that sort of gave me a really important key for my future because I had enough nynorsk, which is, you know, more inflected, that put me with a better foundation for learning Faeroese and Icelandic. And then bokmål gave me more insight into Danish and somewhat Swedish. So yeah, it was just sort of interesting that I got both when I was really young, so that helped me learn the others later. Okay, I'm going to read one more of Kolbeinn Falkes. I'm going to rush because I know. This one's called Reisebrev. De lukkede øyne når vi blir født og ikke tør se. De sløve øyne når vi lever og glemmer å se. De vi åpne øyne når vi dør og ikke kan se. Vi har lite å fortelle. Travelogue. Our eyes close when we're born and don't dare look. Our eyes apathetic while we're alive and forget to look. Our eyes wide open when we die and can no longer see. We have little to tell. So, yeah, this is another, when I look at the language, it's funny because when I translate this first time, I didn't look at the language at all. This does not have dialect in it because he would say itche, and this says ikke, which is bokmål. So, you know, even he who had that dialect was writing bokmål. So anyway, I just, Norwegian has been really important to me. When I translate myself, I cheat, of course. I try to keep things Well, I don't know. I'm looking at this perversion of a sonnet that I wrote at one time, and I stopped it sort of where it ended for me. I could say that was just intentional. I don't remember. But I do see that I wrote some of that in dialect, and then when I decided to translate it many years later, I kept some of the rhyme scheme, but not entirely, and I changed the meter quite a bit. But that's because I decided I was going to make it into song lyrics, I think, and I didn't want it to be overwrought, as it were. So I'm going to read this real fast and go on, but it's called I Øska. Våkner, ligger, ser de siste gløløsne lydløse og brenner seg svala. Venter, mens varmen forsvinner som før, den hjemsøker meg fra ute i gangen. Står sakta opp for å gå ned på kne, og koster vekk øsken fra sent i går. Med hendene i peisen stiller jeg ber, ved tømme den kalde ildens spår. Tungtere bære den utbrente ild bort, og så dens gjenferd svever seg tinn i vinden da jeg kaster det med skyld fra meg, og vet den ryker igjen. This was based on, I don't know that it's not so terribly original in the imagery or anything, but the interesting thing was I was living in this little house in Norway, and it was freezing, and there was one fireplace, and I'd sort of sealed off all the rooms and hoping I wouldn't asphyxiate so I could keep it warm. And you have to keep getting up and keeping the fire going, and yeah, you just gotta keep that fire going in life. It's not easy, So then I sort of transformed this into song lyrics. Everything doesn't correspond exactly, but it's like he said, I feel like the spirit is intact, and I feel like a lot of the imagery is intact, so I'm going to call it a win-win. Since no one knows the original, it was meant that way.
You're safe.
Ashes. I wake in time to watch the last embers silently split apart and cease to glow. It won't take long for the warmth to vanish, despite how I've sealed off all the windows. Why bother getting up only to kneel and pick through memories of violent flames, up to my elbows in the fireplace, emptying out those cold ashes again? It's hard to know the burden of a blaze until you have to drive its ghost away. No matter how you bury the ashes, the wind will whip them back into your face. That was the hard part, getting rid of the ashes, Dirty. So now I'm going to take you, how much time do I got?
10, 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Powering through Faeroese poetry. I'm going to do 4 generations of Faeroese poets in 15 minutes, 10 minutes. We're going to go fast. Guri Hamstal, I lived in the Faroe Islands for 5 years, did my master's there. My degrees are in the social sciences, but I did a lot of ethnographic fieldwork, so I was out in villages, interviewing people constantly, translating constantly in my head and on paper. And I started working more with the writers there maybe after I finished my master's, so I'd say 3 years into my time there, after I'd run my reputation, I started getting to know some of the writers. And one of the nicest, one of the kindest was Guri Hamstal. She just turned 80. And she is considered the first Faroese modernist. And she's also the first woman to publish a volume of poetry written in the Faroese language. It came out in 1963, which is amazing when you think about it. When she was very young, she moved to Denmark with her father. He worked on ships. So she was in Denmark from the ages of 12 to 26. And her first poems were printed in a Copenhagen-based Faroese literary magazine called Øjeskjeg. So when she was 17, she started publishing her work. And her first work is in Danish. So I'm going to read a few of her Danish poems. And my Danish will have a Norwegian accent, just so you know. Disclaimer for all of you out there. Solnedgang. Nu ringer solen ned, den forbløder mellom husene, bak efterårssorte træer. Sunset. Bells toll for the sinking sun hemorrhaging between houses behind the black trees of autumn. Møter. Din hand utan töven sökte min, vårt möte var tyst, men i handfladers mörka holhet sang det som konstlighetsfjärna brosen. Trist. Your hand sought mine without hesitation. Our meeting was silent, but in the dark hollow of our palms was the distant music of rolling waves. Og heimvei. Kom eine verrennande. This poem's actually a switch to Faeroese, but she's still in a Danish landscape, which is interesting. And there's a whole tension between the Faeroese who live in Copenhagen as opposed to the Faeroese who live in the Faroe Islands, just like the Appalachians who live in Appalachia as opposed to the Appalachians who live outside. There's a lot of interesting nuance there. This is called a heimvei. Kom eine verrennande, skulle oppboi en sporvågen som det var styggvande fotler til kæveie. Eine fer en sporvågner fotler og fremmande folke og heimvei. Eine fer fremmande folk og heimvei. Til kæveie i røyerumt. Ta kjende jeg til og heimvei, to mellom fremmande folk. There's actually an image in this that I haven't fixed, but that's always bothered me, but I still haven't found the solution I want yet. This idea of røyerumt, it's like when the sky is sort of flushed pink, if you have some precipitation or fog and the lights from the city make it sort of blushed or flushed. So I'm still working on fixing that, but that's another one of those things that I just don't have it the way I want it yet, because city flush sort of sounds like a toilet. But, nobody's perfect. Okay. Heading home, came running once to catch a packed streetcar. It was snowing. Once there was a streetcar full of strangers on their way home. Once there were strangers on their way home. Snow was falling through the city-flushed sky. Then I recognized you on my way home, you among the strangers. Which I feel like, if you look at that from an identity perspective, or you have being a Faroese person in Copenhagen, maybe seeing another Faroese person, it's just that there's an interesting tension there. And now her poems that have inspired me very much. Her first book was Lutlåt, like Mild Breeze. But these very, very compact poems I think have inspired me, definitely, and is important in Faroese literature too. Morgenfrost. Morgenfrost, ravna flå, vindborne venger. Morning frost. Morning frost, flight of ravens, wind-borne wings. And to save time, I'm going to do a couple more in Faroese, but I'm going to move on. Fjöllene. Fjöllene, skuggene rekande rei, utflyr ljósa reilika. Mountains. The mountains, drifting red clouds, outflies a pink gull. Mountains at dawn. Mountains at dawn, trails of mist inhaling the flight of white gulls. And now this last one is important to me. I'm gonna rush. No, don't much time.
No, take your time.
Okay.
No, I don't want you to rush.
Shh, calm. Okay. This last poem is called Morgen i Mars, Morning in March. She also has a collection by that name, but this is a good example of how do you translate things culturally, especially when it's so compact and you have certain words that you really feel like you're bound to use. So the original is Morgen i Mars. Morgen i Mars, hjertet tjalter, flyr til tøyen. Morning in March. Morning in March, my heart, an oyster catcher, flying to you. And the reason that's so specific to Faroese culture is, you have all these migratory birds, they're coming back in the spring, that's the first signs of spring, but the oyster catcher itself is a very important symbol of Faroese independence that goes back to the 18th century when there was a sailor, a farmer, a poet from the village where I spent most of my time. His name was Nosleopold, and he had a lot of trouble with the Danish ombudsman and was always at odds with them, and they didn't support him. and he was fed up with their corruption, so he wrote this very long satirical ballad called The Ballad of the Birds. And in that, he's an oyster catcher, because the oyster catcher flies along the shore and warns all the smaller birds that the birds of prey are coming. And so he sort of paints all the Danish ombudsmen as birds of prey, and then he's the oyster catcher trying to defend the people of the Faroe Islands. But that idea of freedom, of independence, of spring coming, just all those things in terms of a relationship, you know, giving your heart to someone, that freedom and submission, all these different interesting aspects.
Let us hear that one again. It's so short. Now that we know oyster catcher and all its ramifications.
Morgun í mars. Morgun í mars, hjarta tjaldur, flugir til tún. Morning in March, my heart, an oyster catcher, flying to you. And a Faeroese singer, her name is also Guri, her name is Guri Hansdottir, she took that little poem, Morning in March, my heart, an oyster catcher, flying to you, in the Faeroese, and made it the refrain of a song by the same name, Morgun í mars, and it's such a beautiful song, so feel free to look that up. Okay, I'll quickly go through here. I've only got a few more. Another modernist in the Faroe Islands that I got to know before he passed away was Steinbjörn Jakobsen. And I really admired him. He was sort of a Renaissance man. He did everything. He had worked on ships. He wrote children's books, plays, poems, all sorts of things, travelogues. He was also very politically active in the independence movement in the Faroe Islands. When I was introduced, Gunnar Højdahl, another Faroese writer who just passed away, he was a very kind man, he introduced me to Steinbjörn, and the first thing Steinbjörn said to me was, I thought you would be taller, like I thought you'd be bigger. And this was a man like almost my height, and I said likewise. And from that moment we'd sort of size each other up and we were good. But he had one of his daughters passed away. Her name was Luiv, which translates as life. And so I translated 2 poems just so you could see the difference when you have a sort of how important it is to try to keep that tone, because there's sort of this very staid but permeating grief in the one poem. And then the other one where he's sort of celebrating another daughter, you see the joy, and you can just feel that in sort of the texture of the language and the music in it. So I chose those 2 poems about his daughters so you can feel the difference in them and how I dealt with that. Another funny thing about Steinbjörn, there's actually a really good essay about him written by a translator named Eric Wilson. And in 1970, I think the Faroes withdrew from NATO, and the United States was afraid that if the Faroe Islands got independence, they would fall under Soviet influence. So they invited Steinbjörn, because he was so politically active and sort of like the Nolsoy Podl of his day in a way. I mean, he was, you know, a great poet, teacher, headmaster of the Faroese Folk High School. They invited him to tour the United States so they could, you know, schmooze him. And a translator, interpreter, the State Department brought in to accompany him because he didn't speak English very well. And so this Eric Wilson wrote an essay in the New England Review. It was published in 2016. He won a Pushcart Prize for it. I think it's called I Sing You for an Apple. That's what he, and the Ballad of Steinbjörn Jakobsen on escorting a Faroese poet here around the USA. But the funny thing is that later, they used my portrait of Steinbjörn, because I photographed the writers. They used my portrait with the article that they republished online. And so I contacted the writer, the guy who wrote this essay, and I said, what you don't know is that Steinbjörn wrote a travelogue about you. Like, he went back to the Faroe Islands and wrote sort of his version of it. And so then this guy wanted me to translate all the things he'd said about him so he could see it. It was really funny. Just interesting how things work out. Okay, be quick. Now I'm just gonna, for the poem about his daughter that passed away, because there's 3 pages, I'm only gonna read the English, and then when I read the smaller one about where he's happier, I'll read the Faroese so you can hear, because that's a more, sort of, yeah, the form is a little tighter in the other one. So this is excerpts from Luiv, 1981 by Steinbjørn Jakobsen. 10 summers you were with us, were a part of us, lent us your eyes, lit up our lives, shared your precious mind, a vibrant spring that flowed, a delicate fate was woven. We remain here with our hands full of dreams, but we're not crying for them. A spring has evaporated, a pattern has ended, incomplete, or maybe we just don't understand it, but the memories live on. Right here, close to where you lost your young life, at the height of summer and the fairest weather, your great-grandfather stood February 15th, 1915, and watched both of his sons drown in a storm along with 12 others. I myself walked down this road the day after the tragedy and looked at the skid marks plowed into the asphalt. The shimmering shoreline murmured softly behind the graveyard of our ancestors. They had all experienced loss, though not the hands of men. Nature had taken from them. Maybe it's easier when nature claims a life. What can be said or done about the ocean? By graves like yours, the concept of an angel must have been born. An innocent soul like yours, a pristine lake in its reflection, a fresh morning sky, nary a cloud, a childlike summer sun, ever radiant, so long as we remain here. So still and calm in sleep, a tranquil repose about your face. Many a time I had to come closer and bend down to feel your breath, check that you were still with us. 8780, early in the morning. We were going to guide some tourists to Kirchebe. I wrote the date on a piece of paper, a beautiful row of numbers, but that number 7. I didn't normally dwell on such things. Somehow it kept bothering me. People grew weary from hiking. They walked in small groups. The weather was clear and the trail firm, but I felt a dull fatigue. When I walked into the courtyard, I saw a black bicycle I didn't recognize. Someone was waiting for me, had something to tell me. It was the priest. There's been a terrible accident. Time and time again, the sun will rise, countless eyes will greet her, but 2 eyes are missing, 2 eyes she can't see. So, that was sad. It almost makes me cry when I think about it. He was such a lovely man. The other poem is called Soljebatten. Som ett soljebatten hövet mot gentebatten, grønne fløt du av, undrende en sommerdag. Eie tunne två, kveitande, en firvald sjå, så uten jo, stærende I stå. Flickvarabatten tapprast mot soljebatten, ein ver soljegull tja mer A marigold, my daughter fair, I now behold, on meadow green, admiring a lone daisy, her sparkling eyes squinting at a butterfly. Without a sound, I stand and watch the world go round. Bursting with life, marigold blossoms take flight. All this beauty, my marigold's the world to me.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna read a few by Tore Poulsen because I've done a lot of translation on his work.
And this is the man for which you won the prize.
Right,
Yes.
right. But I'll try to wrap it up. I know we're running out of time. This was the first book that I translated in its entirety, which opened up a whole other realm of things you have to think about when you translate, because you're not just doing one poem. You have to look at all the poems together. Is everything lining up? The imagery, the tone, the language. There's just so many other things you have to think about. There's a fly here.
Mm-hmm.
Translation. Yes. So Tore Poulsen was a student of Steinbjørn Jakobsen at the Faeroese Folk High School. And Steinbjørn Jakobsen was instrumental in encouraging him to publish his work. So that's sort of how this goes along. He was introduced to Faeroese modernist poetry and translations of other poems through a Faeroese literary magazine called Væren, which was really important in the Faroe Islands and bringing world literature to the Faroe Islands, but also giving Faroese writers a place to publish contemporary poetry. That was influenced his work a lot, and he debuted, his first poems were published in 1978, but he debuted in 1984 with his first collection. But this is from Fjaller, so I'm just going to read a few of these. The original Faroese title, Fjaller, it can mean a boat or sloop, the front or back covers of a book, in addition to literal planks and to hide or disguise something. So all this comes into play. A lot of this book is about sort of the Faroese, a phenomenological exploration of the linguistic Faroese psyche and how he's trying to like get back in and see all the different structures that have influenced how you can think about things, your cultural realities. So at the end, the book ends with a poem called Salvation. So it's sort of like he's trying to dissect all the different influences linguistically and culturally that he feels have oppressed him in some way. And so the church plays a big role in that because the church has played an important role in disseminating Faroese literature. So I'm just going to, that's a very quick run over of that. And I'll just read 3 of these and then we'll end there. Drømme. Drømde at jeg som alltid drømmer kravde av mer, at jeg skriver til drømmen nir, og jeg sier vi til at jeg så først må drømme drømmene, men til svære til drømmeløse drømmer, og så skulle til eisene skrives nir, og ta meg i vikinge, at så vil du ikke drømme, og så vakner jeg og skriver dette. His poems often flow like that. In this book, there was no punctuation, there was no capitalization. The only word capitalized was God. So it's sort of, some of the poems feel quite stream of consciousness. I dream. And there's also shifts in tense midway, which is another aspect of translating it that could be interesting. I dream. I dreamt that people who never dream demanded I write down their dreams. So I tell them first they'll have to dream the dreams, but they respond that the dreams are dreamless dreams, and that's how they're supposed to be written. So then I admit that even I don't dream that well, yet wake up writing this.
I could almost hear that one more easily than some. I mean, that was a distinct rhythmic pulse to the voice there in both.
Yeah, I mean, there's, throughout this book too, the poems are dialogically structured next to woodcut prints. And there's this plank motif. Inside the woodcut prints, everything is made of planks inside that, and plants are made of planks. And the subconscious, when he's inside of himself, you see everything planked up. And on the cover, there's a self-portrait that looks just like boards. So I wrote here, his conspicuous use of metaphorical plank motifs throughout the collection, bearing in mind that his homeland is devoid of timber resources. There are no trees. Evokes dimensions of the national culture identity his people have engineered from selectively imported and remanufactured discourses. It's really complicated, but it illustrates that Paulson's conviction that fanatic nation building has had dreadful consequences linguistically and just spiritually in the Faroe Islands. But you also have to know about the church and the important role all these languages and cultures the church has played in structuring the language and the orthography, and the priests in the Faroe Islands. It was a priest, a pastor, who created the modern Faroese orthography, and they were all educated in Copenhagen. So it's really complex. I'm not doing it justice. And then later, the first Bible translations, these are just very important aspects of the culture. And he himself said, when he was growing up, there weren't a lot of children's books in Faroese, so he read the Bible, and hymns were an important influence on his work. So, but it's also, it's just really complicated with the churches and the land and control over the land, and the Catholic Church had it, and then it went under the Danish king, and then all the land became under the control of the Danish king, and he made the Faroe Islands a trade monopoly, so only one person could trade with them. So there's just all these really complicated dimensions to this. But the church has been an important part of the people involved in the church. The clergy have been really important in the language in the Faroe Islands. So, assignment. In this windswept dream, I'm dead tired, on my way down a steep, many kilometers long flight of stairs with a priest who keeps asking me how great it is knowing we also have eternity to look forward to. And I keep giving him the same dispirited answer over and over again. I just want to get home and go to bed because I'm totally beat and don't want to hear any more talk of an eternity. It only makes me more tired. And that also goes through, I'm not doing it justice, but, assignment, I think, and it also has to do with whether you're assigned to heaven, hell, or purgatory. And in Faeroese folklore, one decision I made was to keep priest. They're Lutheran, but to keep it priest instead of pastor. Because even in Faeroese folklore, a lot of times you have the Catholic priests who are dead, the ghosts of them colluding with the Lutheran Faeroese priests to trick the Faeroese. So it's really complicated. I can't do it justice. I'm not doing it justice. But
You mean the Protestants and the Catholics are both out to get you?
yeah.
Jeez.
But it goes back to the land and the control over the land and the resources. And, it was the priests could just put a, black mark. If you didn't go to church, they could take your land away from you, and your land was everything. That's how you made a living. So one more poem. Cragen. Cragen sier kvart du erst, men jeg fryser ikke etter tear, jeg vil bare ikke ha krea, meg først ånga til å kjenne. Caller. Your collar says who you are, but I'm not turning my nose up at you. I just don't want to wear a collar. You'll never get to know me. And in the Middle Ages, both the priests and the representative parliament both wore white ruffles around their necks as symbols of their rank in Faeroese society. So there's a lot of that imagery here. Okay, well, thank you very much. That'll do it. We only got through 2 generations.
Thank you, Randi, very much. Now is the time that we always, during the roundtable, if there are questions you'd like to ask either of our authors, please feel free to do so. I've also got a set of questions for them myself. And there is, if either of you want to make a comment about it, we do, or we can or don't have to. A couple of my own children's books were translated, and I thought, well, if we needed to look at that at some point, there's, well, I have no idea what these are, but it's either Danish or Norwegian, as I recall. Danish. So, and that, of course, solo uno. I can almost do that for my book Only One. So, so questions first, though, from the audience. Anything you want to ask that you're burning to ask off the top of your head? Okay, well, okay, yes, please.
Could Randi read a couple of poems from her Lipsige's book? Does that mean?
Sure.
Would you like to hear some new ones? New ones?
Sure.
New ones? Sure, I can just read a couple. I got a couple new ones. Oh, I'd like to also add that Maggie Anderson wrote a blurb for this book, which I was really honored about. And she also speaks Danish because she had lived in Denmark at some point, which I didn't know when I was a kid. So, let's see here. Quickly. These are a couple new ones, which might tell you where I am in my mind. Mountain. What is there to say when you can never quite get out of your own way? Trough. 10 deer and 2 horses drink from this trough, but the frog never leaves. Pitch pine. So now I'm brave because I stayed and made a stand. You land where you land. Daisy. Forgive my being cruel. If you're left to guess, you already know the truth. Sow. You belong in this sty. I might eat you alive, but I'm still your mother. Hound. No one talks about the difference between bravery and courage. Dandelion. Why should I apologize for losing my head? Make a wish instead. And this is my only COVID poem, I think. Watch. I'm afraid it's already too late. My hands won't stop touching my face.
one of the, yes, yes, please.
Might I ask a
Yes,
question? Yeah.
yes.
So those were written in English, correct? The first poem of yours, the sonnet that you translated then into lyrics, was exophonic. It was upright. It was written. Was it originally written?
It was originally written in Norwegian.
Norwegian. Do you write much in Norwegian or Faeroese?
I do.
And what is that like? I mean, I think I hear in the poems that you just read echoes of the poets that you read to us from. But what is it like when you're moving between either Faeroese or Norwegian and English, and why might you write in one, and what are you playing with sonically?
I'm using this because if I talk too much, my throat gets sore. I'm not used to talking. Okay, trying to think here. So, I feel like everywhere I went, I thought I was going to stay there forever. So I learned the language as well because I thought that was going to be my life. So when I lived in Norway, of course, I'm trying to think no one ever asked me about this. I guess what I'm trying to say is that my life was such that everywhere I went thinking that was going to be my life. So I really absorbed everything as much as I could and wanted to create in those languages because I wanted to be as viable in those languages as I could, which to me, in my mind, right or wrong, this is just my mind, I'm thinking to be able to be fluent in this, because you understand, then you can speak, then you can write well, And so I think I felt like I had to be able to be that flexible in the language to be able to really feel like I knew it. But I guess everywhere I have a very fractured personality as a human being, and everywhere I go, because my lives and all these places were so intense and so specialized, and I really thought that was going to be my life forever. It's like they're all like gloves, And I feel like I think in them, I dream in them, I have different emotions in them, and I think because of the very traumatic background that I had, I used them to get around my own trauma. Like the boat I was in was sort of sinking, so I could jump into this other boat and use it to make new associations with other words while sort of repairing the boat that I just jumped from. So I do feel like I have different personality in all of them, and I feel like I can say things in all of them that I wouldn't necessarily say in English, and I can be something in all of them that's a little different because of the life I lived in all those places. So like, I had a Faeroese poem here that I wrote. My first book was published in the Faroe Islands, and I wrote it in 3 different languages because just things happen in different languages. You feel them in different ways, and the lives I lived in, each one of those was a different time in my life with a specific vocabulary based on what I was doing at the time. So I might be able to write a poem in Faeroese. I can't write in Norwegian. And sometimes I don't know the English words for some of the things I know, because they're very specialized to boats, they're very specialized to hunting, or they're very specialized to the specific landscape there. And sometimes I don't even know the English words. And, it's sort of telling on myself, but I've never learned a language by reading grammar. I've just listened and absorbed it in context, and my sort of overwrought emotional life stitched it together through the emotions of the people I knew. So it's like when I sit down to translate something in a different language, I have to sometimes sit down and turn on the internet, pick up the radio station. So I like slip back into that mindset. But it's also traumatic for me because if I had a bad experience in a place and I go to translate Faeroese, for example, a lot of those experiences come back with it, and it feels strange to me sometimes. It's not just an exercise in academic translating. I mean, I really, this yourself, you feel it. So yeah, I feel differently, and I feel like I have a different voice in each of them, but it somehow filters back to my English self too, but still it's specialized, I guess.
Jeremy, what about you? Do you ever write first in Spanish? And what's that experience like for you? At all similar to Randi's or somewhat different?
Well, I saw the hand, so we'll come to you
Yes,
after
yes.
this. When I was 7, we moved to Nicaragua, and so I grew up in Spanish, and had a weird elementary and then a weird high school education. But yeah, no, I do write in Spanish, and it is different. I mean, the music that I play with in Spanish
The linguistic music.
is different. Yes, the
Yes.
linguistic music, and it is. When writing in Spanish, I mean, my PhD work and my academic work is in Spanish. When writing in Spanish, those literary echoes are much more readily available, and so I will think about, I mean, playing with allusions to various poets. In Spanish is part of what I do, while in English, I mean, I want to say that my Spanish poetry is much more rooted in literary history and in poetic history than my English poetry is. And I don't know why. I mean,
Yeah.
to be right, I mean, because to translate, one has to be able to know well the canon that one's translating into as well.
Sure.
But for some reason, just when writing in Spanish, the literary allusions are there in a way
cool.
that in English I
Yeah,
tend not
yeah.
to.
That's fascinating to me. Yes, a question.
It was about,
Colleen?
I've never been able to learn a second language, so I'm really interested if you sing, Randi, and if you sing or write songs, do you feel like a different personality from just speaking? And I ask this as a songwriter.
Yes, a very good songwriter you are.
You know, anyway, you know, just because I know that I feel like a different person if I'm writing lyrics than if I'm just
Yeah,
writing, you know, something else.
I agree. Like that first one that I sort of deconstructed at the beginning, I felt like the form that it was in when I originally wrote it didn't lend itself to what I was hearing and feeling. So it sort of got unwound. But when I worked with singers, yeah, I just sometimes things, the words you use and how you use them are different. And just to backtrack, when I was in the Faroe Islands, one thing I studied was the Faroese chain dance. And they still have this ballad dancing tradition there. And so I got to hear and feel what it's like when people are together in a community dancing their poetry, and you get a sense of rhythm because you're literally getting the rhythm underfoot as you do it. So it's a lot more visceral, but also you feel and hear the rhythm as you're moving, as you're telling a story together with all these people you have emotional baggage and background with. So the story takes on a whole other dimension. And I feel like that's what I get in my language usage. I get the language, I get the technical things, I get the music, but I also get all of the experiences and things I've absorbed through it. And when I work with singers, I didn't really get to this, but I noticed that I have to be really careful about the music in the words, because certain words, it might be the right word based on the translation, but it just doesn't work. It falls flat, it doesn't stand, it feels weird, it feels wrong.
It goes up or it
Yeah,
goes down.
you can just feel it, the way the stresses fall, just the individual elements of the word. I remember, and then if you're working with someone in another language, you have to work around their pronunciation. If they have trouble with English diphthongs like th or wa, I remember one singer I worked with, she would just sing really, really, really high. And when she was singing so high, she had trouble pronouncing certain words when she was singing up there. So then I'd have to work around, to get it to fit. But definitely when you're working with something that's going to be sung, you just feel it it's either works or it doesn't, and you just know, even if it's the right word, it doesn't matter. It's just a really tactile thing almost. You can just sense it doesn't work. But yeah, I would say to write for singing is different than writing on the page, and to bring it from the page to singing, you make a lot of adjustments. There's so much adjustment, and sometimes when I'm working with singers and they're in Europe or other places, I'll be almost on call 24/7 as they're recording, like, this doesn't work, we gotta change, or they'll say, take out all the these, and then I'll rework it, and there'll be like one thing like, that the is the most beautiful the, it's like, it's I don't know, but I agree with you, you do feel like it's a different type of poetry, and you do feel like a different person in that realm when you're working that way. So I agree.
Other questions from anyone? One thing I wanted to ask both of you is simply, how do you choose a particular story or poem for translation? What is there something that really appeals to you when you feel free, when the job hasn't come to you, but you're just looking amongst writers you may admire?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I'm free and not, so I've worked with some poets, and they've asked me to translate books, and I've done that, and
right.
That, like Randy was saying, one of the things that you want to do is you want to look at the arc of the whole book. You want to make sure that uses of words that have multiple options, that you're consistent with those across from poem to poem, should in fact that be something that matters. Now, on the other hand, I mean, like those, just the ones that I do for myself, because I love it's mainly because I love the poem,
right.
And I love the poet, and part of it is also wanting to learn something from them. I mean, so, but again, wanting to learn something from somebody like Vallejo, wanting to learn something from someone like Gabriela Mistral is mainly because there's something going on in this poem that I just love, and one of the ways that I interact with that poem so that I can understand what's happening is translation, because it is just about the closest form of reading that you can do.
Right. And let me ask a further question, and I'm an idiot when it comes to this stuff, but I should think that as you think about Spanish translation, that there's must be a huge difference between translating a Spanish poet as opposed to translating somebody who's Chilean or from the Central Americas. Is that the case? Are the nuances and accents, dialect come to play?
It's going to depend on how committed the poet is to using popular speech.
Mm-hmm.
There is a literary, and this is one of the things that Spanish has moved away from, but Spanish in the 19th century, or poetry and literature of the 19th century, and then of the early 20th century, was all written in literary language. So one of the major...
a kind of more formal Spanish.
Correct. It is a more formal Spanish, and one of the major differences between, aside from various words, is the fact that Latin America, over time, lost the informal plural you, the vosotros, which is the y'all that
okay.
has then...
We get that here.
Yes.
Okay.
But it has, right, a verb ending to it. Latin American Spanish, everything is you, which is the formal register. And so with one's friends, it is ustedes. With other people, it is ustedes. It doesn't matter. Spain keeps that distinction, and so that's the major one. But up until the early 20th century, Latin American poetry was written with the vosotros. You move away from that in the 20th century, but the real difficulty is how much an individual poet that is a contemporary poet might be using popular diction or turns of phrases and puns that are particular to an individual country. And that can be difficult. But might that, yeah, go ahead.
I think because I started translating when I was 16, a lot of it I felt like was my apprenticeship to these different poets because I didn't have any teachers, and now, well, I was young, I needed the money. No, I did. I mean, I've done corporate stuff, I've done legal stuff, I've done just interpreting directly, subtitles, localization on software. But I think the thing it taught me was a discipline to hunt down the words you need and find what you need to learn what you need. And also, each one of those has its own little culture and its own voice and its own, distinct language. And so I felt like that was part of it too, where I learned that flexibility, and then I feel whatever I don't know I can figure out. It may take me longer, but I'm stubborn. I'm very stubborn, so I can figure it out eventually. But now I don't translate a lot because the older I get, the crankier I get, and the more set in my ways I get. And it's hard sometimes it's interesting to translate someone who's completely unlike you in every way because you learn a lot. And it's sort of like assuming a new voice or teaching yourself new tricks. You always learn something, and that's wonderful. But it also sometimes feels like I'm breaking every bone in my body to get that voice out. And it does, it's painful. I'm not gonna lie, I literally feel like it's torture sometimes when I'm doing this. I never feel like it's right, I never feel like it's good enough. I always feel like there's something missing or that I'm not seeing. There's a lot of self-loathing. We're the worst. You just feel like you're missing something all the time, and you don't want to miss it, and the dedication is maddening. But now I only take on things that won't torture me. Oh, I'm going to torture me. But things that won't, I have to like the person I'm working with. The connection is more important to me than anything else. Like, I need quality connection and quality people. I don't want, drama. I don't want doing all the work. You don't want to end up, this is sort of mean to say, but you don't want to feel like you're putting more work into the translation than the person put into the original.
Yeah.
And I don't like dealing with chasing down the publishers either. Like, I'm just tired. I mean, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I just don't feel like doing the dance anymore. And if there's someone I really like Guri Hamstal, or someone I really respect, like Steinbjørn Jakobsen, or someone that I learn a lot from, who's very dynamic and self-taught and amazing in every way, like Tore Poulsen, you learn that, and you align. I feel like people who align in different aspects of my personality, that helps me have the energy and the right emotion and integrity to do it, because I feel like if I don't feel good, I can't do it. I mean, I can if I have to, but I'm just at the point where I can't mutilate myself anymore.
We're so close to the, okay, yes?
I have a question. First of all, I can't say how much I admire both of you for your translations. I can't imagine how you do it. But I have a question about the last page of Marc's book, Only One, because it goes, there's only one me and only one you, EWE, and the illustration is the female sheep. So, but the fun part is only one me and only one you, meaning YOU. So what did they do with that last page?
Yeah, pero lo mejor de todo es que solo hay uno como yo y solo uno como tú. And so there are a couple of things. I mean, they could have, had they wanted to, gone to y solo una como tú, and that would have kept the solo, would still have the O, because of because there's a difference between solo with an accent and then solo without the accent that is the adjective that can be solo or sola. What they chose to do there was to use the masculine as the neuter form, which in Spanish, the masculine is the neuter form. And so that's what they've done. It's the old, you know, is man woman and man, or is man man? Today, depending on where they are, there's a rather robust debate that is happening in Spanish. In the U.S., you can see it with this question of Latinx, and should we do Latinx or should we not do Latinx? And you've got Spanish speakers of here in the U.S. who some say absolutely this is an abomination brought on by academics and English-speaking academics who don't care about the beauty of the language and they're just running around putting X's in. The problem with that narrative is that Latinx comes out of, yes, it comes out of the academy, but it comes out of, in my understanding of it, which I could be wrong, but it comes out of the Latino or the Latinx Academy. It comes out of Puerto Ricans in the Northeast who are sensitive to questions of gender. And this question of what to do is not just a question that's happening in the US and is not just US academics who are bilingual looking for ways to address the problem of gender inclusivity or gender exclusivity. Within, when I was in Spain in the late 90s and early aughts, this was in mobile phone texting when you had the flip phones and not the smartphones. The at-bat was being used informally by youth culture as they were texting to each other as a way to signal a gender-inclusive group rather than the O or the A. That was only within that sort of small subset of youth culture that were highly techie in Spain. Right now, in Argentina, one of the things that you're getting, still informal, still from youth culture, is the use of the E or the I, so that instead of amigos, it's amiguis or amigues, as a way of signaling that. So what did they do? They went to the masculine ending as the neuter ending. They might still do that today, because I don't know. They don't say who the translator of this is. But there's that possibility, especially if one is in Argentina and one wants to be particularly edgy, that they might have dropped that y solo uno como tú and gone with une como tú.
Yeah.
Oh, the sheep. Oh, I heard she. You were asking about sheep. This is the problem. She's getting old and cranky. I'm getting old and deaf. It's sorry. Why they didn't do with? Why they didn't include the sheep?
Well, no, how could they? How could they
What
include
is the
sheep?
word for sheep?
Oh, what is the word for sheep? Is oveja. Solo hay una oveja como tú. I'll have to look back at the English then. It's been
Specifically the female sheep.
but there's no, but
It's playing off the illustration, I think is what they're asking about. There's a little joke.
The you, because it's like you and you.
Yes. That's the you, and only one you. I am sorry.
But we got such an interesting diversion on Latinx that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise, so. It's all good.
Well, there you go.
Hey, we're almost out of time.
dense.
We're almost out of time. So, well,
We-
I don't know if you have anything you want to say about these
I
syllables.
quickly gotta put mine in.
Sure.
So I had the Swedish and the Danish here. Now, personally,
Which book was titled A Little Excitement?
right, I like both of them.
Good.
I say both translations are very good and very much true to the original, but I prefer the Danish translation.
Good.
I do think it keeps more of the voice of the narrator intact
cool.
in the way it, and also the Swedish tends to break up the paragraphs in a way that you didn't in the original, and just some of the turns of phrase aren't quite like a young boy. Oh, they're the same, but they're just not as colloquial, I would say.
The last thing I want to simply say very quickly, because we are out of time, is that I'd like to hear Jeremy and Randi, is there a particular project that you're working on right now that you're excited about that we should all be anticipating at some point in the future? Jeremy?
Well, yes.
Good. We always want to hear that.
Hopefully soon, a collection of poems originally written in Spanish and then translated into English by me will be coming out. But the project that I'm working on at the moment, this is actually with a student of mine who was born in Venezuela but raised in Mexico until she was 14 and then came to Kentucky. At 14, she and I have been working together on translating Morris Manning's Bucolics into Spanish.
Oh, cool.
And in doing that, have been, you're right, because we've been working with Mexican Spanish specifically, so the kinds of plays on words and the puns that we've been using have been Mexican Spanish.
Great. Look forward to that for sure. Randi?
I've been working on the Randi Ward Sanity Project. It's very dear to my heart.
In what language is that?
I'm not sure yet. I'm still figuring it out. I'm working on it. I did, last year, I translated a screenplay that's being filmed now, I believe, in the Faroe Islands. And I also just finished translating Kim Simonson's poetry collection here. And it was actually recent, his recent one. It was, I finished translating it because there was a woman in Macedonia who was translating it into Macedonian, and she needed my English to be able to translate it to Macedonian, and it's already come out. But the title of the project is Hvað hjálpar en människa vakna í morgun hessa megin þetta ártusende, or what good does it do for a person to wake up one morning this side of the new millennium?
Say that a couple times in any language, quickly. Well, great. We'll look forward to a screenplay. Hopefully. Great. Well, the only other thing I have to say is thank you all so much for coming out. Randi and Jeremy both have books that can be purchased, as do I. And my other note was, if you do nothing else today, go out and buy or read a book in translation. So thank you all for coming so much. And Jeremy and Randi, thank you so much for your brilliance.
I want to apologize to you for having completely overlooked the poor sheep.